Welcome to Zoom In, Zoom Out, your global look at news from Taiwan. I'm Tiffany Wong. Taiwan's Supreme Court has overturned a guilty verdict for an indigenous man who hunted protected animals. This was a case that started more than 10 years ago. The hunter, named Tamatalum, is a member of Taiwan's indigenous Bunun tribe. He hunted protected species to make food for his sick mother. Tama killed the animals without permission using an illegal firearm. He was originally sentenced to 3.5 years behind bars. But what does this ruling actually mean for Taiwan's indigenous ways of life? To learn more about the case, we're joined today by Wasiq Silan. Wasiq Silan is an assistant professor at National Dong Hwa University, where she teaches Indigenous Studies. Wasiq, welcome to the show.
Hello, everyone. It's great to be on the show. I'm Wasiq Silan.
Let's first zoom in. What was your first reaction when you heard about Tamatalum's case as an indigenous scholar from Taiwan?
I'm, of course, very happy that Tamatalum doesn't have to be in jail for this very stupid reason for hunting in their traditional territory. But more importantly, I'm also worried that this official pardon does not really address the deep-seated ideology of Taiwan as a state respecting indigenous collective rights. I think the state should have done more for other hunters who are not necessarily so lucky to get the official pardon, but are also practicing their traditional cultural practices.
What led to Tamatalum hunting these animals for his mother? Could you explain a little bit about that?
From my limited understanding, I think it is a way of indigenous people practicing our own ways of being, ways of knowing, but the state does not necessarily understand or respect our way of living on our land. So they could frame it as tradition versus modern, but I feel that it is very worrying that we have the official apology from President Tsai Ing-wen in 2016, but still indigenous peoples and our ways of supporting our own people are still framed as a way of existing only in the museums, but not in our living context.
Now, do you have a general sense of what indigenous communities' positions were on this case from the very beginning?
From the very beginning, I think the indigenous communities are very clear that we are doing the right thing according to how our ancestors has taught us. We continue our ways of being, we continue our own culture, but with the institutionalization of what constitutes as legal in the current framework of the Taiwan, to continue our culture becomes more and more difficult. So I think the communities know that, and that's why many different communities gather together to support Tamatalum.
And who was most upset by Tamatalum's actions?
I think it is a certain part of conservationists who are very afraid that the animals get hurt and then doesn't get to live on. So they're afraid that if we give this full access for indigenous people hunting this extinct animal, the animals that are going extinct very soon, then it's opened the door for anybody who can just hunt the animals without any limit.
Are there any other examples from Taiwan of clashes between environmental conservationists and indigenous people trying to practice their traditions?
Yeah, there are many cases that these two clashes with each other, but also there are also cases that are not clashes with each other, but they join forces. So, for example, in the establishment of the Macau National Park a decade ago, so the conservationists actually had many different variants, and some of them support that we should establish national park. But then indigenous people, they're also like people have different opinions, and then some of them they support and some of them they don't support. So it's a very nuanced and sensitive issue.
So in 2021, President Tsai Ing-wen pardoned the Bunun hunter Tamatalum out of respect for indigenous traditions, but the pardon did not actually acquit him of the ruling, only the punishment. The court's ruling now clears his record. Do you think this is enough?
Of course, I don't think it is enough. I feel that it is just patches that they want to put on this case and then to show that Taiwan is indeed a multicultural state. but then it doesn't address the deep-seated ideology of what consists of safe, what is cultural rights, and whether when different rights intersect with each other. It's a way for the government to show that they are very generous and Taiwan has moved on. But I am more skeptical of how that really means for indigenous communities at the collective level.
Could you talk more about those cultural rights that Indigenous people should also have?
Many of our cultural rights there actually exist in our everyday practice. So in my research in care, there are many different ways of looking at what consists as good care. And in Tamadalum's case, it's about what consists of supporting your own communities, your mother, and then respecting the forest and spirituality that's existing in this context. So it's definitely the tradition and conservation. It's not a zero-sum game, but it's two sides of the same coin. And I think this cultural rights needs to be put into this nuanced context in order to show that we're actually on the same boat together, both indigenous peoples and the conservationists who want to preserve the environment.
Could you talk a bit about how Indigenous people can contribute to conservation efforts?
For example, you can see that many different examples from Canada or the US, especially last year in the summer, that there are a lot of wildfire. And actually, the indigenous peoples in Canada, their cultural burning practices are very important, and it should be part of these management practices. And you can also see that we have this kind of knowledge among indigenous communities. For example, the post-disaster zones in the southern part of Taiwan, we have our own knowledge of how do we rebuild our own community. And also, like there are in Taiwan community, we have this initiative called Millet Art. So it's actually kind of combining the ecological care, our own community care, and then to rebuilding the community system by looking at the whole system as an ecological, as an ecology, the whole holistic way of looking at things instead of looking at specific species.
Now let's zoom out. The Mata Loom's case also raises questions about elder care in Indigenous communities. What is elder care in Taiwan's Indigenous communities right now?
So elder care for indigenous peoples is not just care given to the elderly. So we need to look at it more holistically, or as you said, to zoom out. So it's about giving care, receiving care, and taking care not just among people, but also among different generations, among different spiritualities, ancestors who are both existing and who has passed on, and also with the environment between different species. The system, it's also that the ideology, the deep-seated ideology of what constitute as good care is not really inclusive of indigenous people's perspectives. So that should be addressed, and that should be also included in our ongoing transitional justice discussion.
What have you learned while speaking to Tayal elders? What challenges do they still face in getting this care?
The first thing that to address is that they should be part of the discussion table when we're deciding what should be included as care. Because currently our way of decision model is extremely hierarchical. And this kind of bureaucracy excludes indigenous perspectives, and it shows deep-seated disrespect against indigenous ways of being and ways of knowing that the elders have.
How can Taiwan's government and society in general best support Indigenous people?
Yeah, I think it's very important for the policymakers and the practitioners to see indigenous peoples in their living context. So I think the first way is to see indigenous peoples as who they are. And the second thing of the policy, what the policymakers could have a decolonial lens to really see that how their policies are made, and they should really problematize these ideology that when they are making these policies and they have certain assumptions of who indigenous people are, what consists as safe hunting practices, what consists of good care, and this side of flipping the coin and really giving the power, sharing the power to the indigenous communities.
Could you tell us about how Indigenous communities around the world are tackling elder care? Is there a model you would suggest that Taiwan follow?
Well, at the moment, I think the most evident examples are from the North America and New Zealand and Australia. And the Council of Indigenous Peoples has sent year after year this kind of like visiting groups to learn the practices of like how do we combine the medical care and also the indigenous ways of healing. From the Nordic countries and especially in Finland, what we are doing there is to really integrating the indigenous language as the main medium for communicating. So then to make sure that the cultural and linguistic rights of the indigenous elders are respected in this kind of social and health services.
So you mentioned transitional justice earlier. What does transitional justice mean for Indigenous people in Taiwan?
Transitional justice for me, it means that we need to seek truth together, both the government, at the central level, the local level, and also among indigenous communities, both older people, younger people, men and women, and people who are transgender. So everybody could participate in seeking the truths that were hidden from the past. So we need to look for the truth together, and then we can see how can we move on. So it's integral to this idea of reconciliation and healing. And that's how we can move on from the assimilative, hopefully past, to the future that both or many different in people, Hakka people, Hoklo people, indigenous peoples, and people coming from Southeast Asia and from outside of Taiwan, we can all thrive on this island while retaining our own linguistic and cultural tradition and heritage. So I think transitional justice in Taiwan, it has many different aspects. And normally in the government, we try to push this as one homogeneous block. But then I think to truly, really seek truth as a very first step, we need to really look into different communities in order to tease out these societal contexts, like in care, that in social work, in hunting. So then we can better move on and then seek what to do together in the next step. So for me, transitional justice is a process for us to better move on to the next stage of this society. And I think Taiwan has made great strides towards a more inclusive and multicultural society, but I'm hoping for more.
Okay, thank you, Wasiq. It was really great to hear all your insights.
Thank you.
This has been Zoom In, Zoom Out. For more stories from TaiwanPlus News, follow us on social media. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.
经历过人生的话，你发现说，我们大部分都是爱美的。
我自己少遇见一朵花，我可能就不是这个样子。
开始思考什么叫做一个本土性，
大声的唱出来说我是台湾人。
In the face of adversity, the power of truth.
A roadmap for a just and open world, charted by the freest country in Asia.
Taipei for TaiwanPlus.
TaiwanPlus News, a voice of freedom in Asia.